Texting mistakes that you're making at the early stages of dating. What's going on, ladies? Welcome back to another video. If you're new here, my name is Lion. I'm a dating coach, and today I want to talk about one of the topics that I get asked about most frequently. Texting is not something you can go around these days, right? If you're meeting someone, whether you met them in person, you met them online, or however else you might meet someone new, you're probably going to start building this potential relationship through texting. So you need to get better at texting in order to even be able to move forward. One of the things that I see happen most frequently is when everything starts off pretty well, and then over time, say a few days, sometimes a few weeks, or maybe even a few months, things kind of just fizzle out, right? So you get stuck in the texting stages. You're not able to move into the dating stage, and you're really not able to build a relationship because most of these interactions that you're having with new guys that you have met stop during these texting stages. So in today's video, I want to talk about some of the most typical mistakes that you might be making, even subconsciously, that are holding you back from potentially moving on to the next stages, dating someone, and actually being able to build a relationship with them. So let's get right into it. All right, so first things first, and you probably will say that this is something that seems to be very obvious, but trust me when I say this, this is probably one of the biggest issues that I see with women and texting, and this is one-word text messages. So this applies to just more than just texting for the purpose of dating. This applies to just becoming a better conversationalist in general, becoming a more interesting person to talk to. And this really comes down to your ability to open the conversation up with each response, with each reply, with each text message, with each interaction that you're having with someone, right? You always want to keep that in mind. You always want to think that, is this text message that I'm about to send, is this opening or is this closing the conversation down? And you always want to try as much as possible to be opening up the conversation. So let me give you a few examples to tell you what I mean by that, right? So let's talk about, let's say you taking the initiative and starting a conversation with them. Right? So let's say you want to start up a conversation. Instead of just starting with a one-word text, right? So something like, hi, hello, or, what's up, or just something, as short as that. The answer to that question is always going to be very short as well, right? If you say hi to someone, chances are they're just going to say hi back. What you're doing is putting the ball in their court, right? So you're kind of initiating, but at the same time, you're not really opening up the conversation. Now, I know this applies to both men and women, but again, becoming a better conversationalist really falls down on both of us. So if you want to become someone that's more interesting to talk to, and if you want people to actually carry on a conversation with you and get excited when you text them or just get excited to talk to you, you want to pay attention to that. You want to open up the conversation as much as possible. So instead of saying something like, hi, hello, or anything along these lines, you already want to start with something a little bit longer. Now, I'm not saying you should write a whole essay or a whole paragraph, describing your day or everything else, but you do want to kind of open up with a little bit more information and something a little bit more specific that they can potentially use in order to, again, continue and grow the conversation. So for example, instead of saying hello, you can say, hey, I was just driving by your work, or hey, I don't know, I watched one of your videos online. I was kind of thinking about you. It's been a while. We haven't seen each other. What's going on with you? What's new with your life? Right? So again, it's kind of the same thing. You are doing essentially the same thing. You're just opening up the conversation. But as you see, right, when you say hi to someone, they're just probably going to say hi, and chances are it's too dry to really continue and build on a conversation on that, versus the other way where you are volunteering a little bit more information that makes it a little bit more interesting for them to respond, right? You are already kind of mid-conversation instead of trying, very hard to crank something into a conversation. The second mistake that I see a lot of people make, especially unconsciously make, is developing or adopting the interrogation style or interview style line of questioning. Sometimes we get stuck into asking people a bunch of questions because, again, we think that we need to do all that in order to keep their attention, or we need to become a better conversationalist again, or become a little bit more interesting. And we heard somewhere that what we're supposed to do is ask people questions. So we kind of go overboard with it. It's good to know and good to take interest in another person and ask them a few questions, but it's really does the opposite effect if all you're doing is kind of developing or, again, adopting that interrogation style. So how are you? What are you doing? What are you doing this weekend? What are you doing tomorrow? You know what I mean? Tell me about your zodiac sign. Tell me about your favorite color. Tell me about, and you just kind of develop this, I'm trying to get to know you, and just asking all of these questions, not really allowing them to participate in the conversation. Again, if it's really one-sided and if you're not allowing them to, stop during these lines of questioning and be able to reciprocate, ask you a question and kind of like go from there. So it becomes a conversation rather than a one-way line of questioning. No one likes to be interrogated. So the rule of thumb here, the easiest thing that you can do in order to avoid adopting this style of questioning is to always think about kind of like a ping pong game. You want them to reciprocate. So let's say you ask the last question. You go back, you read your text messages, and you notice that you've asked the last question. Let's say you ask them about, what do they like to do for fun, right? And they tell you about like their hobbies, they tell you about their interests, they tell you about their passions, and they're sharing all of these things, right? It's okay to kind of like give them a chance to reciprocate that interest and ask you a question. And hey, sometimes, right, they might not ask you right away. Sometimes they might take a little bit of time. They might be in the middle of something. They might be at work. They might be at school. They might be, walking their dogs, and they might be distracted by something else. They might, there could be a whole bunch of, reasons why they're not responding to you right away. And your job is to be able to be comfortable with that, to just say, hey, you know what? They have a life outside of that. I have a life outside of that. And if they're not responding to me right away, I'm just going to, get busy doing my own things. Right? And eventually they will respond, and eventually they will see that, the questions was asked to them. And the easiest thing for them to do if they want to continue the conversation with you is to just throw their ball back right in your court. Number 3, and this is kind of my personal pet peeve when it comes to texting, especially with people that I don't really know very well. And that is when we are having multiple conversations at the same time. I don't know if this is something that you have encountered or maybe something that you sometimes do, but this is, again, one of my biggest pet peeves in texting, especially people that I don't know, is when we're trying to kind of respond to a few different questions and carry a few different conversations at the exact same time. So when someone texts you one text message and be like, hey, how was your weekend? You mentioned that you're going to like whatever event, XYZ event. How was that? At the same time, they share something about their day that happened. Hey, you know what? By the way, I got a ticket today for parking, blah, blah, blah. Remember I told you I was outside of my building. And then they have another one where they talk about like, them getting accepted to the whatever job that they wanted to, get, or the job they applied for or whatever. And another thing that might be something else, you know what I mean? I got injured at the gym yesterday and now I have to respond to them in 4 or 5 separate text messages as well, addressing each separate thing separately, right? This is annoying. This is very tiring. And trust me, this is one of my biggest personal pet peeves. I literally just ignore most of the things and just choose one thing and respond to that one thing. And sometimes I understand that they may feel that I'm ignoring or I'm not taking an interest in them. And again, that's one of the reasons why a lot of these text conversations, right, die off before they even materialize into dating, before they even go anywhere. So avoid them as much as possible. Don't try to carry too many different conversations, too many different questions in the same thing, right? Start with one thing. You want to share about your day first. When that's over, when that's finished, then jump to the next thing and talk about the next thing that you wanted to talk about. Which brings me to the 4th point, and that is do not double, triple, quadruple text someone, right? As I mentioned before, sometimes you might catch people in the middle of something. So what you never want to do is create an environment, create a dynamic where you are entirely the pursuer and they are the pursuee. I see this mistake happen too often sometimes when we're trying to make excuses for the other person, right? I hear ladies all the time tell me like, well, I understand that he's busy and I understand that he has a lot of things going on, but I know he's kind of interested because he responds really well and he told me that he was interested. So I don't really mind texting him first all the time, right? So what I see a lot of DMs look like is you're asking a question or you're talking about a specific topic, them basically not responding at all or just responding very shortly, and then you double texting them, you triple texting them, even if they don't respond. That creates a very specific dating dynamic where you are the pursuer and they feel like the pursuee. It's definitely not the dynamic that you want to build with a man that you're trying to date, and definitely not the dynamic that you're trying to build with a man that you're trying to build a relationship with. Right? You always want to kind of like make sure that you give him enough time and an opportunity to respond to your text messages. So it's more or less a two-way street rather than you doing all the pursuing, rather than you becoming very aggressive and double, triple, quadruple texting someone. There's no such thing as being too busy. No matter how busy a person is, right? A text message takes literally 3 seconds to write. depending on how long the text message, but it takes literally seconds to write. So no matter how busy you are, you have to give them the opportunity to respond, and you have to be comfortable enough and confident enough within yourself to say that, hey, if he doesn't, then he doesn't. If he doesn't respond, and that might be because he's not that interested or he's too busy or whatever, then I'm just going to have to find someone else, someone who is invested, someone who is interested in me and dating me and you know what I mean, and is going to make the time and make me a priority for that. So being able and being comfortable with just walking away from people who do not give you the same amount of effort that you decide to give them. Ladies, do not, under no circumstances, especially at the early stages of dating, decide that it's a good idea to double, triple, quadruple text someone who hasn't responded to you. Number 5 is to avoid negativity. Ladies, I want to remind you again that especially if it is at the early stages of dating, the whole point that we're trying to make, right? The whole reason why we want to connect with another person is because we're trying to make our lives better, easier, right? We're naturally, as human beings, both men and women, are attracted to people, right? And want to continue getting to know people who make us feel good, who make us laugh, who make us chuckle, right? Those people that we look at our phones and we just smile and we laugh because they just have all of that positivity. They have that positive energy, right? And again, this doesn't mean that the person you're talking to has a perfect life and everything is amazing with them, right? But even if something is not going the way you want it to go, there are people that I'm sure you can think of in your life that have a very specific perspective when things do not go their way. They still look at life. They still look at these situations as a glass half full type of thing, right? They're still positive. They say, you know what? I'm still going to make it. I'm still going to get what I want. You know what I mean? Or there's a plan that's bigger than me that I'm going to get what, you know what I mean? It's about your entire energy. It doesn't mean that you need to pretend that you have a perfect life or whatever. But again, especially if it is at these early stages of dating, I want to remind you that the person you're talking to, especially if this is a new person that you recently met, they're not your psychologist, right? They're not your therapist. They're not your best friend either. They're not your mom. They're not your dad. They're not your brother or sister, right? They're not someone that needs to be there when you have all of these things that you want to share, these difficulties. There might be other people in your life, right, that you know for a long time, that you might want to share these things with and talk with these people, and you want to, use them for support. But this person that you recently met last week at the, pickleball tournament or maybe online or a dating app, right? He's not that person. She's not that person for you just yet. Maybe eventually there will be, you know what I mean? But at this point, you want to keep the conversation as positive as you possibly can. And yes, sometimes it does mean that you want to avoid talking about certain topics if you know that it's going to lead to a bit of a negative place, right? Think about it this way. This is not about not being genuine to yourself. But if I asked you, let's say, hey, how's your day? And I'm just a guy on the elevator at work. You don't know me very well. You might have seen my face a couple of times. Are you going to share these deep feelings that you might have because something happened that is making you very emotional that day? Probably not. You're just going to say, good, how are you? Right? So it's not about not being yourself. It's about not allowing anyone into the depths of your life, if you will. Right? There's a time and place for everything. So they need to earn that level of intimacy, that level of trust with you for you to be able to share these things. Number 6, and this is a mistake that I see happen way too frequently. And I know so many women swear that they won't engage in these things, that they won't make that mistake, and then they make that mistake. And that is sexting. Right? I feel like so many people just prematurely engage in that level of intimacy. They say to themselves, well, since it's only by text message, what the hell? I don't really need to have a boundary. I feel safe because I'm in the comfort of my own chair, my own bed. I'm at home. You know what I mean? So I don't really need a boundary for that. But I want to be here to remind you, ladies, that you absolutely freaking do. Because as soon as you start engaging in any levels of intimacy, and yes, sexting is a huge level of intimacy, right? Because you can't go back from that, right? Once you start sexting someone, it's just a precursor to what's happening next, right? Their entire energy, their entire focus then, and yours as well, might shift into that very specific type of relationship. Right? How many times did it happen to you? And you can share it in the comments that you've maybe decided to do a little bit of that, especially with maybe a person that you haven't even met in person just yet. And then you found out pretty quickly that that's all they're doing. And you're like, oh, that's all they want. And you cut them off. Definitely don't engage in sexting, especially with someone that you haven't even met in person yet. And even if you have met them in person, if it's only been on like a 1 or 2 dates, it's definitely not a time to start sexting them, right? Because the problem with that is that, again, it creates a very specific type of dynamic and it shifts the focus. Right? When we are engaging in sexting, we are no longer focusing on really getting to know one another and focusing on, going on dates and everything, because we kind of feel like we're getting all of these like hormonal responses, right? Because when we're engaging in that, the reason why it feels so good is because it floods our brain with hormones. It floods our brain with oxytocin and dopamine and all of these things. And we're just trying to get that high again. So next time we text them, instead of really focusing on potentially booking the next date or, trying to, get to know one another, find any sort of common topics of interest or anything that we can potentially use in order to really move on to the next stage of actually dating. Instead, we just go into sexting again, right? So next time they're going to text you again, it's going to be based on what they think they need to say at that point, or in order to, again, engage in that level of intimacy that will, again, flood their brain and potentially yours as well with all of these like feel-good hormones. So you definitely want to set very strict boundaries around that. All right, this brings me on to number 7, which is a huge topic and something that I see so many people, both men and women, do wrong when it comes to texting, especially at the early stages of dating, is when they're overdoing it. So don't overdo it. Again, the whole point, the only reason why you are even texting someone at these stages. So again, let's say you met them on a dating app, or let's say you met them at the gym, let's say you met them on the street or whatever, and you start texting them. Again, what I want you to understand, what I want you to remember and remind yourself from time to time, the only reason why you are texting them is because you're trying to see whether or not this is going to go to the next stage, the dating stage. And it is during the dating stage that you are getting to know them, that you're really getting to know them, not during the texting stage. So you really want to keep these text messages as short as possible, right? So not the individual text messages. What I'm talking about, the length of you just going back and forth, only texting each other, right? You want to meet them, and within a few days, within maybe a week, or maybe even a little bit over a week, you already want to have solid plans and actually go on a real physical date. You want to go for a walk, you want to go for coffee, you want to go for ice cream, you want to go for tacos, you want to do something. You want to start seeing them in person and go from just talking and into actually dating them. This is the whole reason why you're doing it in the first place. So ladies, as soon as you feel like, there's enough in common that you're just enjoying yourself talking to this person, that it's just pleasant and you would feel safe meeting them in person, that's the time to actually go on a date. No matter how compatible you are, no matter how interested both of you were originally, it just gets boring. If this is someone that you haven't even met in person, or maybe just met in person that 1 or 2 times, right? Eventually, if all you're doing is texting them, again, no matter how interesting you are, and no matter how good conversationalist they are or you are, eventually, if this is not a person, if the relationship doesn't progress, right, it just gets boring, and it just eventually, sooner rather than later, just fizzles out because you run out of things to say. There are specific ways, there are specific types of conversations and things that you can say and do that progress these things, right? That move things forward. Because ladies, I want to remind you that it's not just about you sitting and waiting, right? And engaging in a conversation and then just hoping that eventually he's going to ask you out. The burden, right, of moving the relationship forward falls on both of you. And again, there are specific ways that you can do that. Ladies, I don't mean, by the way, that you need to reverse the roles and ask him out. I don't think that's a good idea. There are specific things that you can do and say at these stages that move things forward, or they just basically give him the indicator that you're not there to waste your time. So again, if enough of you say dating stages in the comments, maybe I'll make a full-on video and explain what some of these examples might be in order to move things forward. In the meantime, if you're not subscribed to this channel already, make sure you do. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and tell me in the comments if there are any other things or any other questions that you would like me to address, and I'll potentially choose some and make my next video based on those. In the meantime, have a wonderful day.